Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here to deliver the second lecture. They build upon one another, but all of them also stand on their own. So some of you may have come yesterday, but those of you who didn't come, you will find some of the links. Anyhow, in yesterday's lecture, it was pointed out that the secularization of Western European societies, understood here simply as the drastic and progressive decline in religious beliefs and practices among the population, is a social fact that is not in question. What is questionable is the theoretical explanation of European secularization as the necessary outcome of process of modernization. Since, as we pointed out, modernization in many parts of the world in the last 50 years has not been accompanied by any noticeable religious decline, but rather by different kinds of religious revitalization, one needs to put into question the assumption that modernization necessarily leads to secularization. In the last revisionist reformulation of his theory of secularization, in his book, The Many Altars of Modernity, 2014, the great European American sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, proposed to change the focus from secularization to pluralism. He argued that modernity does not produce necessarily secularization. What it does produce inevitably is pluralism, specifically two diverse kinds of pluralism, namely religious pluralism and secular religious pluralism. In Berger's own words, quote, "The new paradigm should be able to deal with two pluralisms, the coexistence of different religions and the coexistence of religious and secular discourses." This is crucial in my view. We need an argument that is able to account simultaneously for this dual form of modern pluralism. We need to account on the one hand for religious pluralism, that is, for the emergence of a global system of religions, which I call global denominationalism. We also need to account, on the other hand, for secular religious pluralism, that is, for the emergence of differentiated but coexisting religious and secular spheres, both in social space and in the minds of individuals. The emergence of these secular religious spheres was the topic of yesterday's lecture. Berger's new paradigm, however, is still too embedded within the theory of Western modernization that views modernity itself as the carrier or catalyst of both types of pluralism, multi-religious pluralism and secular religious pluralism. Countering Berger, I would like to argue that European modernity is certainly the carrier or catalyst of the second type of modern pluralism, the secular religious one, but not of the first one, multiple religious pluralism. As the exceptional process of European secularization amply demonstrates, modernity per se does not contribute to religious pluralism. We need an additional factor or an analytical framework to understand the emergence of a global system of religious pluralism, and this, in my view, has to be a theory of globalization, a globalization that both precedes Western secular modernity and continues in an accelerated and transformed manner after Western secular modernity. In other words, global religious pluralization emerges before Western secular modernity in the early modern era of global interreligious encounters that accompanies the European colonial expansion, and then religious pluralization becomes accelerated in our contemporary global age in such a way that it begins to transform in the process also the heartlands of European secularization. We need a theory that is able to encompass the intertwined European roads of internal European secularization and of external global European colonial encounters with the religious other. As I will try to show in the third lecture on Thursday, it is the second road of external global European expansion that serves as catalyst for the formation of global religious pluralization. So European modernity leads to secularization, but not necessarily to religious pluralization. Globalization leads to religious pluralization, but not necessarily to secularization. The intertwinement of both processes is what produces the combination of the two types of pluralism and simultaneously and the simultaneity of global religious and secular dynamics. In order to emphasize the intertwinement of the two European roads, the internal one of homogeneous confessionalization leading to religious decline, which is the topic of today, and the external one of global colonialism and culture with a religious other, leading to religious pluralism, the topic of tomorrow, I propose that we take 1492 as the symbolic date that marks the beginning of both processes. Choosing 1492 serves to complicate both our narratives of Western modernity and our narratives of globalization. On the one hand, 1492 marks the decision of the most Catholic kings to expel Jews and Muslims from Spain in order to create a religiously homogeneous realm. In this respect, it marks also the beginning of the European-wide process of early modern confessionalization of a state, nation, and people based on the principle cuius regio eius religio. The sovereign determines the religion of his subjects. It was always his. The principle that served to organize the Westphalian systems of states throughout continental Europe. When I talk of Europe, I'm going to talk of continental Europe. The British Isles are somewhere in between the discussion tomorrow of the United States and continental Europe. And we can discuss it. You are the experts on it. We can have a conversation perhaps tomorrow about it, because I'm not going to talk about the British case. On the other hand, as the date of the discovery of the New World, 1492 is also the symbolic marker of the beginning of the European global colonial expansion initiated by the Iberian monarchies. The Iberian colonial expansion, the Portuguese one into the East Indies and the Spanish one into the West Indies, made possible the connection of the old world of Afro-Eurasia and the discovered new world of the Americas, linking the East in West Indies, thus forming for the first time one truly global world in novel transatlantic and trans-Pacific exchanges. This is what is new. The transatlantic and trans-Pacific exchanges, it what is new in the new globalization. In this respect, the early modern phase of globalization constitutes literally the first globalization. Most importantly, early modern Reformed religion in Europe, whether Lutheran, Calvinist, or Catholic, can hardly be understood as a traditional form of religion. It was the outcome of a prolonged disciplinary process of confessionalization led by national churches under state sponsorship. This disciplinary process created new types of religiously homogeneous societies throughout continental Europe. A homogeneously Protestant North, a homogeneously Catholic South, and 3 biconfessional societies in between, Holland, Germany, and Switzerland, each characterized by their own patterns of internal territorial confessionalization based on confessional pillars in Holland, Landeskirchen in Germany, or cantons in Switzerland. Indeed, the reformed character of early modern religion challenges the basic assumption of every modernization theory that is based on the passage from traditional Gemeinschaft to modern Gesellschaft. Only a secularist modernist understanding, which views every form of religion as traditional, could have characterized the religion that resulted from the disciplinary reformations of the early modern absolutist state in conjunction with the state churches across Europe as traditional in any meaningful sense of the term. Taking seriously the religious transformations brought about by early modern confessionalization opens up the possibility of explaining the exceptional character of European process of secularization, not in terms of general process of modernization, but rather in terms of the particular European historical dynamics of confessionalization and deconfessionalization. Within European discourse, the secularization of the European state is usually understood as a felicitous response to the religious confessional wars of early modernity. But in fact, the religious wars of early modern Europe, and particularly the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, did not lead, at least not immediately, into the secular state, but rather into the confessional one. The principle cuius regio eius religio, established first at the Peace of Augsburg and reiterated at the Peace of Westphalia, is not the formative principle of the modern secular state, but rather that of the modern confessional, territorial, absolutist state. Nowhere in Europe did religious conflict lead to secularization, but rather to the confessionalization of the state and to the territorialization of religions and peoples. Ethno-religious cleansing stands at the beginning of the process of formation of the early modern confessional state. In the same way as the formation of the Catholic Spain required the expulsion or the forceful confessionalization of Muslims and Jews, the formation of a homogeneous Protestant Northern Europe required the expulsion or forceful confessionalization of Catholic minorities, and the formation of a homogeneous Catholic Southern Europe required the expulsion or forceful confessionalization of Protestant minorities. What made the religious wars almost inevitable in Western Europe was not so much the supposedly intrinsic intolerance and fanaticism of religion, as emphasized by secular accounts. It was rather the ingrained conviction inherited from the Constantinian establishment and shared equally at the time by religious and political elites that there could possibly be only one single Christian church within the same political territory. Even those Christians who honestly sought peace and concordance among the warring Christian communities could not envision the political possibility of religious pluralism. Only the sects who abandoned the ecclesiastical model of a confessional state church also rejected the political model of absolutist state control of religion implicit in the formula cuius regio eius religio. But they in turn had to abandon Europe and find refuge as immigrants in the Americas, in the New World. The Westphalian settlement, implemented throughout continental Europe outside of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, solved the problem of religious conflict by the elimination of religious pluralism through the enforcement of religious homogenization. European secular self-understandings tend to attribute the difficulties of accommodating religious pluralism to the intolerant character of religion itself, without reflecting upon the extent to which early modern process of religious confessionalization may have affected, if not determined, posterior secular developments. The story of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is illustrative in this respect. At the very moment when every continental European state assumed an absolutist confessional form that led to the persecution and expulsion of religious minorities, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth constitutes the only interesting exception in all of Europe. The so-called Republic of Nobles, res politica, made room for the coexistence of the three main branches of Christianity, because there was a Polish Catholic Szlachta, there was a Prussian Lutheran Szlachta, and there was a Ukrainian Orthodox Szlachta, or nobility, all of them sitting in the Polish-Lithuanian Sejm, in the parliament. Moreover, this was a time when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth became the refuge for all religious minorities which had to flee the process of enforced confessionalization. Radical sectarian minorities such as the Moravian Brethren and Hungarian Unitarians, but also the Jews from across Western Europe. This is the time when the Jews settled precisely in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And Muslim Tatars all found refuge in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at least temporarily. Telling is the fact that the absolutist principle, cuius regio eius religio, was not significantly altered by the change in sovereignty from the monarch to the nation or the people, with the fall of the ancient regimes, or with increasing massive democratization in the 20th century. European societies have remained throughout the 4 centuries homogeneous, religiously homogeneous societies. And the only significant change has been that from belief to unbelief. In this sense, the process of European secularization can be understood best as a process of deconfessionalization. Deconfessionalization of states, deconfessionalization of nations, and deconfessionalization of individuals. But returning to an argument already initiated in yesterday's lecture, one can also distinguish between the Nordic pattern of soft deconfessionalization, which could be characterized as belonging without believing, that is secularization without unchurching, and the more radical deconfessionalization of the Catholic South that accompanies laicist unchurching. Bringing back again the analytical distinction between the Durkheimian socially sacred and religious of individual salvation may help to elucidate the main differences in the two patterns. The modern process of secularization leads to a dissociation of the collectively sacred and the individualized religious, and to a new relocation of the sacred in the secular public sphere on the one hand, and in the individualized and privatized religious sphere on the other. In the Nordic Lutheran pattern, notwithstanding all the significant difference between the various Nordic countries, one finds a loose fusion of ecclesiastical institution, the Lutheran Church, the state, and the nation. The Church becomes an administrative unit of the secular sacred state, which even still today falls under the parliamentary, popular, national democratic regulation and supervision. The Parliament of Norway not only chooses the bishops of the Church of Norway, but also determines the confession, the doctrines of the Church of Norway. The socially sacred, in Durkheim's terms, has been relocated to the secular sphere of the state and of the nation. Luther reassembled the dualism of the Augustinian two kingdoms theory in novel ways that led to the relocation of the sacred, the religious, and the secular. Most importantly, and this is the key difference with the laicist Southern Latin pattern, the core dualism between the religious clergy and the secular laity is dissolved by mutual infusion, so that, as Jan Wittes from Emory University has pointed out, the scholar of religion and law, Luther's doctrine of the priesthood of all believers at once laicized the clergy and clericized the laity. The clerical office of preaching and teaching was secularized, becoming just one secular vocation like any other, while the traditional lay office now became forms of divine calling and priestly vocation. This was a quote. The Church is also radically transforming the process. A new dualism now emerges between the ecclesiastical institution, which as visible church is just part of the seculum that falls under the law of the early kingdom, i.e. the state, and the invisible church of the eschatological communion of the saints. In the process, the true religion, the kingdom of God, of love, and of the gospel, mutates into a religion of inwardness and migrates to the individual conscience, giving birth eventually to pietist movements on the margins of the ecclesiastical institution, which prepare the ground for the modern cult of the individual and the sacralization of human rights. Secularization or soft deconfessionalization in this context means, first, continuing adherence to the national church, which remains under the jurisdiction of the national sovereign. Second, drastic decline in religious beliefs and practices all over Scandinavia. And third, interiorization of a modern individual spiritual realm, which becomes the authentic space of the sacred. There are no doubt tensions between the three domains of the religious secular sacred: the democratic national collective, the civil religion, the ecclesiastical Lutheran church, and the individual inward conscience. But there is no radical chasm or schism between the three. The Southern Latin Catholic pattern evinces different dynamics of dissociation and relocation of the social sacred, state and nation, the ecclesiastical institution, the Catholic Church, and the religion of the individual, or actually individual without religion. The process of absolutist confessionalization is based on a close alliance between throne and altar, but the transnational structure of the Catholic Church and papal supremacy do not allow the kind of integration and fusion of the two one finds in the Nordic Lutheran pattern, even under Caesaropapist Gallicanism. The secularization of the state takes place through a radical break with the Church, which resists this establishment. The schism here leads to a protracted chasm, indeed to a kind of prolonged civil war, within the social circle between a new republican laicist civil religion and the old national Catholic religion. The Latin Catholic path of laicization is marked not by integration, but by civil, ecclesiastical, and lay clerical antagonism. It maintains rigidly the boundaries between the religious and the secular, but pushes those boundaries into the margins, containing, privatizing, and marginalizing everything religious. When it breaks the monastery walls, 200 years later after the Protestants did it, it will not be to bring the religious into the secular world, but to laicize them, dissolving and emptying their religious content and making the religious persons, monks and nuns, civil and laic, before forcing them into the secular world. Deconfessionalization of state, nation, and individuals here means assertive, anti-Catholic, and churchy. Denmark presents the paradigmatic case of a European society with one of the lowest rates of religious beliefs and practice, 3% of the population, accompanied by one of the highest rates of confessional affiliation in the national church, the Church of Denmark. In this respect, to be Danish, to be Lutheran, and to be secular are one and the same thing. This contrasts with the Southern Catholic pattern, France, Belgium, and increasingly Spain, but not so much Portugal or Italy, of radical secularization and laicist deconfessionalization. The secular is understood here in drastic, laicist, anti-clerical, and often anti-religious terms that demands assertive and churchy. Spaniards, in my own country, in post-Francoist Spain, who took the resisting Catholic Church to court in order to get their names erased from the Church's baptismal registry, may serve as a vivid illustration of this assertive deconfessionalization. In my 2009 essay, The Religious Situation in Europe, in which I discussed the significant variations in patterns of secularization within Europe, I argued that those could not be simply explained in terms of levels of modernization. Different dynamics in church, state, nation, and civil society, associated with different patterns of confessionalization and deconfessionalization, could account better for the difference, for instance, between the more secularized East Germany and the more religious West Germany. I don't think that many people would say that Germany is more secular because it's more modern than West Germany. Or between the more secularized France and the more religious Italy. Or between the more secularized Czech Republic and the more religious Poland, to take two Catholic, Slavic, post-communist societies. Yet, notwithstanding all significant differences, European patterns of secularization share similar paths from homogeneous religion to homogeneous secularity without noticeable dynamics of religious pluralization, other than the more hidden dynamics of religious individuation, which Thomas Lundgren characterized as invisible religion. At the level of individual consciousness, moreover, Europeans usually experience this process of deconfessionalization and the accompanying individuation as a process of temporal liberation from ascribed confessional identities, as freedom from religion. Phenomenologically, Europeans tend to experience secularization not so much, as Berger would argue, as a process of spatial differentiation within their consciousness of coexisting religious and secular modes, which according to Berger would correlate with the differentiation of religious and secular spheres in society. Rather, Europeans tend to experience secularization as a historical process of religious decline that is of temporal and spatial supersession of the religious by the secular. As pointed out in yesterday's lecture, this is the secularist moment of a philosophical conception of history tied to the Enlightenment critique of religion that understands the secular as a post-religious temporal stage. The secular is what comes after religion. In my view, the combination of the dynamics of deconfessionalization jointly with this secularist state of consciousness account best for the unique pattern of European secularization without religious pluralization. Outside of Europe, by contrast, in much of the rest of the world, both the dynamics of confessionalization and deconfessionalization, as well as the secularist style of consciousness, are usually either absent or take very different dynamics. Even though, as we will see in the next two lectures, in many post-colonial situations, modernizing elites as well as the modernizing state develop very strong secularist projects. One finds, however, much more frequently religious pluralization and religious secular pluralism with milder secularization. One could add the theories of secularization in Europe have actually functioned as self-fulfilling prophecies, insofar as large sectors of the European population have taken the assumption of progressive secularization for granted as the inevitable consequence of progressive modernization. The postulate of progressive religious decline has become part of the modern European definition of the situation with real consequences for any kind of church religiosity. If to be modern means to be secular, then to be religious means not to be modern, and very few people want not to be modern. Once the secular nation state took over from churches and ecclesiastical institutions their traditional historical function as community cults, that is, as collective representations of the imagined national communities and of the collective memory, churches also lost in the process their ability to function as religions of individual salvation. Crucial is the fact that individuals in Europe, once they lose faith in their national churches, do not bother to look for or actually look disdainfully upon alternative salvation religions. In a certain sense, the explanation lies in the fact that Europeans continue to be implicit members of their national churches even after explicitly breaking away from them. This peculiar situation explains the lack of demand and the absence of a truly competitive religious market in Europe. The culprit is not so much the monopolistically laziness of churches protected by state regulation, as the American supply-side theory of religious markets tend to argue, but the lack of demand for alternative salvation religions among the unchurched, even in the face of new enterprising but generally unsuccessful religious suppliers. Moreover, in Europe, the model of religious homogeneous uniformity was transferred to the modern secular nation. Modern European nationalism is grounded in the same logic of uniform homogenization, as if the imagined community of the nation were a secular translation of the imagined community of the national Christian church. Not surprisingly, the Jewish question re-emerged again and again throughout continental Europe with every transformation of sovereignty and with every modern nationalist mobilization. In Western Europe, the arrival of West workers, immigrants and refugees from the entire globe has reopened the question of the transformation of post-national European democracies under new conditions of religious pluralism. I purposefully bring the Jewish question in the formation of the European secular state to memory, because the Muslim question throughout Europe today has deep structural similarities with the Jewish question in the past. European analysis of the difficult problem of integrating immigrant Muslim communities into European nation states, a problem shared by all European states and all European nations, too quickly attributes the problem to the nature of the fundamentalist character of Islam, which seems unable, quote, to accept a fundamental differentiation between state and religion. While partially valid, such analysis fails to take into account the ingrained difficulty of European societies to accommodate religious pluralism. The main thesis in today's lecture has been that particular historical patterns of confessionalization and deconfessionalization offer a better explanation of the internal variations in patterns of secularization one finds within Europe than levels of modernization or than the alternative American paradigm of religious markets. As final illustration of the thesis, let me conclude by offering a brief analysis of the divergent religious and secular dynamics one finds today in 4 post-Soviet societies, namely in East Germany, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. 4 societies, all neighbors to one another. East Germany Protestant, Poland Catholic, Ukraine Orthodox, Russia Orthodox, but 4 radically different. East Germany, as everybody knows, is the most secular society of Europe, the only society in which the majority of the population at the time of the Wende in 1991, 51% of East Germans declared themselves atheists. What has happened after the lifting of state secularism? Nothing. No religious revival, no religious growth whatsoever. East Germans remain as religiously tone-deaf as they were before. And of course, they are much more tone-deaf than West Germans. East Germans that have become much closer to West Germans in every other respect. There has been a certain convergence in political culture, economic culture, in consumerism, and so on, not in religion. The 2 main German churches, the evangelical and the Catholic, have not been able to gain new members in East Germany. Nor are there many, many new entrepreneurs, religious, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, you name it, Baptists, Pentecostals, all of them have tried in East Berlin and throughout East Germany, no luck. So, at least East Germany proves that certainly there is no universal process of desecularization. Also that indeed there is such a thing as homo religiosus. The societies can live, be integrated without religion. But at the same time, it clearly puts into question precisely the notion that it is modernization that brings this. Again, it is the particular dynamics of confessionalization, deconfessionalization that distinguish West Germany and East Germany. East Germany was the stronghold of the Protestant Reformation, obviously during Luther, and it has gone through a process of repeated confessionalization and deconfessionalization. First, with the Prussian monarchy, a Calvinist house ruling over a Lutheran population, the 19th century fusion of Darwinism and Marxism into a kind of scientific atheism, the role of Berlin as the kind of secular metropolis, the Weimar Republic, the Nazism, then the East German communism, all of them have been accumulated processes of radical, aggressive secularism. And all of them have their main base in East Germany, not in West Germany. And so in this respect, I think that we can use it as a model. Now let's change to Poland. Poland, of course, is the opposite case. Is a highly religious society that saw no secularization before communism, or very little. Actually, there was secularization in the interwar period when you had a free, independent Poland. But no secularization under communism. And in this respect, unlike the East German case, in which the communist regime was very successful in his forceful secularization from above, the Polish communist regime was very unsuccessful. And most interestingly, because everybody expected that finally, after communism will come the normalization of Poland. Once you have a normal democratic state, legitimate, then of course everybody is going to follow secularization, as did Ireland, Catholic Ireland, Catholic Poland. Well, very little has happened. The rates remain almost the same as they were at the time of the transition. 95% believe in God, 92% Catholics, again, very few, 5%, no religion, no religious affiliation. We cannot forget, as mentioned, that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the region of religious pluralism, and this remained throughout the partition Prussia, Russia, Austria. At the turn of the century, before World War I, before Polish independence, the population in the Polish lands was roughly 55% Catholics, just barely a majority, 15% Ukrainian Greek Catholics, 15% Orthodox, 12% Jews, and 6% Protestants. It was the only religious pluralist country in all of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. But then after World War II, through the Holocaust, eliminating the Jews, through the territorial changing of borders, moving the borders of Poland west towards Germany and from the Soviet Union, and the massive ethnic relocation of the population, what you find is, for the first time, a homogeneous Catholic Poland. So yeah, you have a Catholic confessionalization, but it happens beginning the 19th century as a mobilization from below against an illegitimate foreign rule. So it's not confessionalization through the state, but voluntary from below. And so the Poles associate their religion with their freedoms, with their becoming modern, with their gaining their rights. Instead of being free from religion is what makes you modern. Actually, it was through religion in all their facts. In the 19th century, against the Nazis, against the Soviets, that they became, if you wish, free. There has been a big change in Poland. The Catholic Church does not control the public sphere. The state is truly a secular democratic state. You have a certain sense of model pluralist nation, particularly on issues of public morality, gender morality. It's a huge. The Polish population doesn't follow the dictates of the church. And yet, people keep going to church. Of course, there is a decrease from the high, unsustainable levels of solidarity in the 80, 90% to the 50%. But still, over 50% of people go regularly to church in Poland. So no secularization, but also no religious pluralization. So Poland is an exceptional case for both, for the European theory of modernization, secularization, and for the American model that should have precisely secularization, because it has such a homogeneous, monopolistic Catholic country. So, let's move to Ukraine. Ukraine is, let's call it multi-denominational Orthodox Ukraine. Ukraine is the only European country that has broken with the European model of church, state, national religion, and religious minorities, and has basically created a model of plural national churches, leading to basically what is the American system of denominationalism. There is no anymore church and sects, majority, minority religions, but because you have three Orthodox churches competing with one another, plus the Greek Catholic Church, all four of them claiming to be the national church. This would happen in the United States when you have three churches claiming to be the national church of the United States. None of them became the national church. And then, of course, you have also a rapid growth of Protestant minorities, Baptists and Pentecostals, the presence of Jews, the presence of Muslim Tatars, and the basically growth of new religious movements. So Ukraine is the evident case of post-Soviet religious revival. No other society in the post-Soviet system has had such a religious revival as Ukraine. And it's continuous, it keeps growing, and it helps every single religious community. The three Protestant churches, the three Orthodox churches, because there were so many unaffiliated unbelievers under the Soviet. And today the only group that shrinks more are the atheists. They gone in the last decade from 4% to 1%, and the unaffiliated and mature from about 11% to 5%. The rest are already somehow affiliated and religious, relatively much higher rates of religious also practice than Russia. Again, it's not the state regulation that explains religious pluralism in Ukraine, because the state regulation in Poland or in East Germany didn't produce religious pluralism. It is the particular model of confessionalization of Ukraine between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and the way it has gone through different processes. I'm not going to go through the history, but what happened, and let's look at Western Ukraine, which is the most religious and the most pluralistic religious region of Ukraine, after Glasnost. Once their Greek Catholic Church could come back, the majority, around 55%, went back to the Greek Catholic Church. But almost 40% remain Orthodox now in three different options. And a lot of them became Baptists, a lot of them Pentecostal. So you have in Ukraine, which has, Western Ukraine, which has 15% of the population of all Ukraine, has 40% of its religious communities. And it is the stronghold of all the groups, all the Orthodox churches, the Greek Catholics, the Baptists, the Pentecostals have a stronghold in Western Ukraine. So in this aspect, you have a case of religious pluralization coming together with precisely modernization, rather than secularization. And then let's come to Russia. Russia, what you have is a process of reconfessionalization through the state without religious pluralization and mild religious revival. It's true, you have a continuous growth of people that feel affiliated with Orthodoxy. So that today, basically, to be a Slavic Russian, you are an Orthodox automatically. So they are reverting to the confessional ethnic model under the Russian Empire. Although Russia also began a process of confessionalization at the same time as the rest of Western Europe, being an imperial state and absorbing so many different religions, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Shamanic, they could not have simply a confessional Russia. They had to accommodate imperial religious pluralism and tolerate the other religions. And this is the model now, which basically, with the fusion of Putin and the Russian Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate is this model. Slavic people are Orthodox, naturally, and they must be, and they have to be enforced as Orthodox. The rest are ethnic groups, so you have, while you had originally under Yeltsin, you have a new secular constitution that basically protects religious freedom. There was a change in the constitution that basically makes difference between three religions. The national religion of Russia, which is of course Orthodoxy, the Moscow Patriarchate, the historic religions of the empire, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, and the ethnic Baptists and Germans, Protestants, which are recognized as historic religions of Russia, and all the other, the new religions, which are not recognized and have difficulty accepting being tolerated by the state, and the state has to basically force them out as foreign agents. So what we find, in brief, and with this I conclude, is we have examined the very different religious dynamics of four post-Soviet secular societies. East Germany and Poland, so practically no religious change after transition. Lutheran East Germany shows no evidence of religious growth, despite the drastic communist secularization, while Poland shows very little evidence of religious decline, despite the high rates of religious life under communism. Ukraine and Russia show clear evidence of religious revival after communism, but with very different dynamics in different directions. Ukraine evinces a pattern of religious deconfessionalization towards open denominationalism, with increasing religious pluralization and dramatic rates of religious growth. Sunday schools, ministers, religious communities, they keep growing. Russia evinces a pattern of increasing Orthodox confessionalization in the direction of a state-protected hegemony and more moderate sense of religious revival. Clearly, none of the competing general paradigms, modern secularization, competitive religious markets, or the desecularization of the world, can account for these diverse post-communist religious dynamics. I have put forward the argument that only a comparative historical analysis that pays attention to the particular historical patterns of confessionalization and deconfessionalization can begin to account for these remarkably divergent religious trends within the same region after a very common 50 years of communist rule. If one can find such divergent modern religious trends in such similar neighboring Eastern European societies, one should expect to find even more divergent modern religious patterns around the globe. But this is a topic for the final two lectures on Thursday and Friday. Thank you.